There it is. So hopefully you can see that now. If for some reason I say I've put a chart up and you can't see it, maybe Zachary can tell me if it fails to load, because I can't tell from my end. So as I said, we're moving into the Aries phase. And if you look, and I'll just get my pen happening here. If you look at the sun in Naught Aries, that's the sun entering into the very beginning of Aries, the sign of the equinox. And of course, it is a point associated with balance. Now, whenever the sun's in Aries, then the earth, that's directly across from it's in Libra, the sign of balance. And well, balance is what we're not seeing much of anywhere in the world at the moment. Things seem to be great extremes on the world scene. And if you look at this, and I should say that the equinox chart gives a bit of a synopsis for the next 3 months. And now I've cast this particular chart here for Canberra. You can see that there. I've cast it for Canberra. So if you wanted to look at it for Oslo or something, it'd be different, but it'd be different in terms of where the planets fall, but necessarily the pattern is the same. And this is this chart and the dynamics within it. It's a bit of a mud map for the next 3 months until we get to the solstice, the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere and the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere. So it's really just a 3-month mud map. And so the striking thing that jumps out is that it's out of balance, which we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks, about the fact that we have a Pisces stellium there and an Aries stellium there. Now, Pisces and Aries, they're very different signs of the zodiac. The Piscean energies often quite hidden. Things aren't always what they seem, and there's a lot of emotional content with it. The Aries energy is fairly dynamic, but sometimes very selfishly driven. And of course, we can see on the world scene that there's a lot of selfish drivers going on everywhere. And there are a lot of, we all suspect, but we don't know that there are things we're not being told, things that are being hidden. One of the things that jumps out at me with this chart is the placement of the planet Chiron. You see Chiron there, looks like the letter K, and it's sitting on this black line, which is the 7th house cusp, and it's directly opposite the ascendant. So Chiron's 21.5 and the ascendant's 19. Now, if that was in an individual's chart, I'd probably say to them, be careful that you don't make yourself ill. You're probably very stressed. There's something to be healed in the relationships you're having with other people. And the message with a Libra on the ascendant for Australia, because this is an Australian, East Coast of Australian chart, is that something's very out of balance with the relationships that's creating a breakdown. The fabric of society can be breaking down. And of course, we can see that everywhere. And then the other thing that you'll notice is the red lines, the squares, there it is there, that goes up to the planet Mars. Now, what happens when Chiron's square Mars? Well, when Mars is in Cancer, we tend to be very preoccupied with our own emotional security, and we'll do almost anything to ensure that it's safe. It's not a very helpful position, Mars in Cancer, and we often create a storm in a teacup, or a storm in a kitchen, or a storm in a family, or a storm in a nation, trying to fight for what we feel will give us security. Now, this pattern impacts everyone on the planet. Mars in Cancer square the Chiron. So, you know, really what it's saying is that if we take a nationalistic stance on all kinds of things and consider that we've got our back against the wall and we're fighting to the death, then things will be falling apart rather than repairing, because the purpose of Chiron is to help us move from the personal through to the impersonal, from the unreal to the real, as Blavatsky would tell us, from the worldly, materialistic to the spiritual. And in order to do that, we need to think for ourselves and recognize where we're being driven by emotions. Now that might be, I mean, most of us aren't living in a war zone. Most of us have shelter and food, but the sense of self-preservation can be very, very strong when Mars is in Cancer, and it can literally create a war, you know, a war within a family or a nation or within a group of nations. Yeah. Okay. Now, if you look at, excuse me, if you look at the chart from the soul's perspective, then I start looking at the planet Mercury. Looks like a person with a hat on. And the Mercury has been retrograde a few days. And Mercury asks us to go inwards, to find our own counsel through inner reflection. Yeah, not to sort of follow whatever headlines we might have read or somebody else's view on things, but rather to be able to meditate and contemplate. And if we can't find our own answer, then stay silent. So that's a message from the soul for all of us. And then if I take a higher view, because with astrology you can look at the exoteric, that's how the personality sees things. We can look through the eyes of the soul, which we're attempting to do, but you can also look at the chart from the perspective of what is it that the holy ones, the spiritual hierarchy of Earth, what is their purpose for the next 3 months? So if I'm going to look to the purpose of the spiritual inner government of Earth for the next 3 months, well, then I must look at the planet Uranus. And that's because Uranus is the hierarchical or the global ruler of the Aries stellium. And the first thing I notice, certainly in the Australian chart, well, no, it's actually not, it's everyone's chart, is that Uranus trines, this is the blue line, the south node in Virgo, and the green line forms a sextile to Saturn and the north node in Pisces. And then if you're following, I'll get you to hit your mute button, please, B. Thank you. Yeah, so, and that's such a pattern as that is known as an easy opposition. And so the holy ones would ask that we make transformational change on a fundamental earthy level, shelter, housing, food, and that we reach out through the sextile and offer support or succour or network. So this is clearly suggesting to humanity en masse that we need to, you know, walk a mile in our brothers and our sisters' shoes and reach out and extend to others and do things that are different to our previous response and put our hands in our pockets. That's the Taurian energy. When it comes to things like shelter, money, aid, things like that. Yeah. I might just leave that there and see what Zachary's got to say. Where are you, Zachary? Can you have a comment on that? You might have to unmute yourself, Zach.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted now. Well, to me, the outstanding feature of this chart is the combination of so many planets in house number 6, which is service, yes, selfless service, and healing. So what is revealed to me is a really, really strong emphasis upon healing ourselves of whatever issues we have, whether physical issues, emotional issues, mental issues, whatever. That's a priority. And actually, this chart is not too bad if we understand that there's such a strong sixth house focus, and we focus on selfless service and or healing, then we're doing the right thing. Yeah. The chart's not too bad because we've got a Sun-Venus conjunction, which is very favorable. Venus being the planet, being one of the two benefics. Jupiter is the other one, or bringer of good fortune. And Venus is also the ruling planet of the horoscope as a whole because of the Libra ascendant. So Sun conjunct Sun conjunct Venus and Libra rising. That's a pretty good combination. We also have a nice sextile aspect, a 60-degree angle between the Sun Venus conjunction and Pluto in the sign Aquarius, and it's in the fourth house of the chart. So that can bring some really positive influences, events, perspectives, provided we undertake the necessary journey to healing and also refine our selfless service. So to me, this chart has a lot of good potential. But the problem is, will the ordinary Australian, the ordinary individual in this country, choose the path of healing and of service, or not? And that's the big question, you see, because I think in any horoscope, no matter how good or how difficult, the key factor is will the average person respond to the potentials in the horoscope? So to me, this is not a bad chart, not at all, provided we focus on the really important issues of healing and selfless service.
Thank you, Zach. And I'm also reminded with the sixth house where the sun is, that it's associated with our day-to-day life. And of course, the big issue in Australia that's coming up is the cost of living and how that's being played out with the election that'll be here sometime before the next month or two. And one of the things that many people are having difficulty with possibly is the Saturn. People are doing it tough with their day-to-day life, yeah, with their, ability to have money for medicine or things that are just considered essentials. And certainly that's been a fairly strong focus of at least one of the major parties, is to say, look, we hear your concerns. We're there for your health and your healing and your cost of living difficulties. Yeah.
If I can also add that the moon in this horoscope, which signifies sort of day-to-day concerns or maybe even hourly concerns, is placed in the second house, which is money, possessions, and finance. And that means that for many Australians, millions in fact, the fluctuations in the cost of living on a day-to-day basis, even certainly on a week-to-week basis, sometimes on a day-to-day basis, is going to be a very strong focus for the next 3 months.
Yes, yes. And as Zach's pointing out, that moon in Sagittarius, if you follow the lines, there's a whole lot of blue lines there. So some of the Australian populace are managing okay, but can you see the dotted red lines? And the dotted red lines that both go to the moon, and they go from Mars to the moon, and then the moon to, what is it?
Well, the moon is forming a trine aspect to both Mercury and Venus.
It does. It does.
So that is a really good position, especially for day-to-day concerns. In my opinion, anyway.
That's right. But it does have the sesquiquadrate, which goes to Chiron, and so this square between Mars and Chiron, these stresses on a family, because Mars in Cancer does have a great deal to do with family life. So stresses on family and the economies of the family. And when there's a square and a half, people often feel that someone else has the power, and somehow or other they are restricted and maybe people will want to punish, we hope not, but punish the government, thinking, well, they must be the ones that have the power and they have the money and we haven't got enough. And of course, if we take this chart and look at it from a European perspective, it wouldn't have Libra rising, and the moon will be in a different degree. So some of the things that we've been talking about will be true, but there'll be other nuances. Yeah. Maybe before we go on, I'll just see if anybody has any comments or questions that they'd like to ask about this. No? No? Okay, well then I might see if I can go to the next chart, which we were going to look at. And so just remember that what we've been talking about there, basically takes us up until the solstice, either the winter solstice or the summer solstice. So now we're going to look at Donald Tusk's chart, which is, I've just got to find it, chart number 21. Where is it? No, it's not. There it is, up the top. So can you see Donald Tusk's chart now, Zach?
I certainly can.
Very good. So we're going to leave this to Zach to kick off the discussion around this. Tell us who he is and how we would have heard about him, because I confess that I haven't heard of him until you'd mentioned him last week.
Well, Donald Tusk is a former prime minister of Poland. I forget how many years he was in power. I think it was the early 2000s. And then he was defeated by the opposition. I think he went to work for the European Union for some years. And then in recent, I think just in the recent few months, he was returned to power in Poland. Now, Donald Tusk is also someone who is pushing to dramatically increase the Polish military, which currently is about 220,000 service personnel. He wants to more than double it to 500,000. And he's a very strong anti-Russian, anti-Putin advocate. So we can pretty well see where he's at. He basically despises Putin, despises Russia. And I should say that if you know the history of World War II, that's not at all surprising, because Poland suffered really badly, both at the hands of the Nazis, the Germans, and also at the hands of the Russians. So they were sort of the meat in the sandwich, and they suffered really quite badly in World War II. So it's perhaps no surprise that Tusk is so anti-Russia and anti-Putin. However, let's take a look at his chart to see if we can see what the deeper influences at work are. Okay, well, first of all, he's got Capricorn rising, very early degree of Capricorn, 1 degree Capricorn. Capricorn is an earth sign. It basically governs career, profession, business, social status. So it's probably not that surprising that Tusk is a seasoned politician. His ruling planet, the ruling planet of Capricorn, is Saturn, which is found in 13 degrees of Sagittarius. And that indicates probably his preoccupation with foreign policy, overseas policy, because that was a concern of his during the time he worked for the European Union. And it's become a really, really hot focal point now that he wants to dramatically increase the military personnel in Poland with the stated view, quote unquote, of keeping Europe safe from Putin and Russia. An interesting chart, we look at the 10th house and we see Scorpio on the midheaven and the moon's north node in Scorpio as well. Okay, house number 10, the house governing career, profession, and business. It's interesting that that's a house associated with the sign Capricorn, and Tusk has Capricorn rising. So we see this is a secondary Capricornian influence, even though it's a different sign. We're looking at Scorpio. Well, Scorpio is a very interesting sign. It's really functions on 3 levels, and I'll just briefly indicate what those are. The lowest level of Scorpio is sex and sexuality. No, I don't know anything about Tusk's personal life, so I can't comment there. Second level of Scorpio is death and dying. And the third level is esoteric, is rebirth through esoteric studies. Now, it seems to me that given his recent pro-war, pro-armament rhetoric, he's responding to the second level of Scorpio, which is and then that second level would be death and destruction, chaos, war, whatever. The fact that he has his north node in that house indicates that on a soul level, on a higher level, he has prepared himself through past lives for leadership or potential leadership roles, which he's now occupying. I think the big problem in this horoscope, though, is when we look at the sun and Venus. They're down in the third house, actually not that far from the nadir or low point. Okay, Sun conjunct Venus, well, that's a good position to have in any horoscope, because Sun conjunct Venus indicates that the planet Venus is very strong, and the Venusian energies are usually positive. They can be considered to be someone who likes culture, who likes art, or even has artistic talents. It's a very social position, and the person generally considered is a nice person, a nice individual. But these planets in Tusk's chart are in the third house, and when we look at the moon in the first degrees of Aries, that's also in house number 3. So to me, that would indicate more of an academic, someone who's an academic and would function better in the academic world. I think the real problem in this chart is when we start to look at the aspects or angles that are formed to the Sun-Venus conjunction. First of all, let's take a look at Uranus in 2 degrees of Leo. Uranus forming a square to the Sun, Uranus forming a square to Venus. That indicates a certain unpredictability, a certain volatility. And because Uranus is in Leo, the sign of leadership, it might indicate that at times Tusk becomes delusional in his ability to lead his nation or lead maybe even Europe in the right direction. And what I can see, my own personal opinion, is the direction he proposes to lead Europe in is not a positive one. We also see that at the moment we're getting a transit of Pluto at 3 degrees of Aquarius. Now, there's nothing there in the natal chart, but as Chandra's drawn the red arrow, that's where Pluto is now. And Pluto is forming a 90-degree angle, a square aspect to the Sun and also to Venus. And Pluto is opposing natal Uranus. So the fact that Pluto is in this section of his chart, to me, is rather concerning. It indicates he's liable to make some mistakes, some errors of judgment, and he's liable to possibly take decisions which may be impetuous, which are not that good for either his nation or Europe. Let's shift the attention now and look at the position of Mars. Mars in his horoscope is in the 6th house in the sign of Gemini. And what we're hearing now out of Europe, and particularly nations like Poland and some others like Denmark, believe it or not, who their prime minister, Mette Frederiksen, also wants to drastically increase military spending. So in Tusk's chart, we see Mars in the 6th house, which can indicate using the military to serve the good of the nation, to serve the good of Europe. The problem here is that Mars is afflicted, is forming an affliction. It's forming a 90-degree angle to Jupiter at 22 degrees of Virgo. And that's in house number 8. And house number 8 is a little bit concerning because, like Scorpio, the 8th house governs these 3 aspects: sex and sexuality, death and dying, rebirth and regeneration. So Mars square Jupiter, to me, indicates a certain amount of wastefulness or delusion when it comes to military matters and military spending. Mars is also forming a 90-degree angle to Tusk's moon, which is at 1 degree of Aries. So this is what I guess you'd call an out-of-sign square aspect. So we got Mars in the 6th house in Gemini, which can give a really good outlook in terms of the direction of the military, but that Mars is fairly badly afflicted. Mars square natal moon, Mars square natal Jupiter. And as Chandra pointed out to me in a discussion we had earlier today, what is it, Chiron? Yeah, Chiron in the 2nd house is square the nodes. Chiron at 17 degrees of Aquarius. Yeah, there it is forming a fairly close square to the moon's south node, which is conjunct the nadir in Tusk's horoscope. Is that right? Yeah, 1, 2, 3.
Yes, to square the angle.
1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Square the angles, yeah.
Okay.
6
I'm
degrees.
not sure. I'm not sure which. Okay, the south node is at the south node would be near the
Oh, there
nadir.
it is. Oh, so beg your pardon. Yes, Chiron square the nodes.
Yeah.
That's right.
To
Yep.
me, to have a south node near the nadir of a world leader with Chiron squaring that node is just a little bit dicey. I'm sorry. I just see the possibility of Tusk going off the rails with this position. And also he has Mercury, he has his Mercury retrograde in Taurus, smack dab the south node, indicating that he thinks, the way he perceives the world is very much influenced by the past. And of course, as mentioned, Poland had a really difficult past in the World War II era. And of course, after World War II, it was basically a Soviet satellite state for a number of decades, I think until Lewinsky came along in the early 1990s. So to me, that position of Mercury conjunct the south node indicates that Tusk isn't necessarily looking forward so much. He's looking backwards and he's basing his future vision or his perceived future vision on what is actually past. So that to me is a little bit concerning. And I guess when we look at, there's one other aspect which I think is also concerning. Look at Neptune. Neptune at 1 degree of Scorpio. Neptune is the planet in its higher sense of compassion, universal love, impetus toward meditation, self-realization, introspection. And of course, that's really good in a spiritual horoscope. If you have a strong Neptune, that's a wonderful placement. But Neptune has a lower aspect, and the lower aspect of Neptune is delusion, deception, self-deception, whatever. So when in the horoscopes of con men, I think you'll always find a strong Neptune. Problem in Tusk's chart is that Neptune is in opposition both to the Sun and Venus. It's in opposition to the Sun-Venus conjunction. It's also square the position of Uranus. And at the moment, with Pluto moving through 3 degrees of Aquarius, it's getting hit by the transiting Pluto.
Yeah.
So his Neptune is really getting hammered, both in the natal chart and also particularly by the square from transiting Pluto. So it's a very interesting horoscope. It'd be interesting to see what his most recent past life was.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, Zach, when you say that some of if this was an ordinary individual's chart, I would say to them, you know, that there's a few things. Esoterically, can you see the 11th degree of Scorpio? This is associated with fear. Yeah.
Okay.
The 6.5 degrees of Scorpio is associated with the degree of physical comfort, i.e. getting caught in a rut. The 19th degree is associated with ambition. So some part of his future vision is clouded by fear. I look at his Saturn right on the 12th house cusp and I say, if this person doesn't resolve their most recent past lives, they are bound to repeat them and live in a holding pattern, getting stuck by fear. And yet also, when they come out of that, driving forward with strong ambition. So I don't have any doubt that he is a perfect mirror for many of his generation who have experienced the trauma of the Second World War. And somewhere, you know, he's responding out of the old trauma. And that's, as Zachary said, the Chiron, you know, square the nodes, you know, and the sign of Aquarius has a great deal to do with not only Russia, but also the Baltic states. One of the things that happens when you have a lot of Taurus is that one tends to take the safe conservative path. And then when you've got a whole lot of planets gathered around the South Node, one can get bogged in the past. Clearly, I think the Uranus has got a very strong soul energy to do with being able to transform the trauma. So I would speculate that he's had particularly traumatic experience in the Second World War, and that probably people his generation and maybe older, it's like a collective trauma that Poland's experienced, and then we have a leader who matches that. So if he was able to transform, and of course we don't know how much work he's done on himself, has he moved beyond some of the old patterns from the Second World War, or is he stuck in old fear and running scared? But as Zachary says, it's an interesting chart, but karmically very loaded. And I suppose maybe we get the leaders that we deserve. You know, according to the karma of the country and how much of it we've resolved, we find that we attract leaders who reflect the psyche of the average citizen. So I think maybe he's a perfect person because he matches some of the history of Poland. But I would hope that the very prominent, as Zach pointed out, Pluto that's sitting over here, opposite the Uranus, can open the heart and bring courage to the heart and change. Otherwise, it's kind of like hiding under a blanket. That's the prominent Neptune, on the basis of old fear and being stuck in very deep old patterns that are hard to shift. Yeah, so it must be a very, very hard job to be the leader of a country. Especially if you haven't processed your own shadow. Yeah,
for sure.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, we wouldn't wish it upon us. Let's move on now. We're going to look at the chart of Ursula. She's chart 11. Just tell me if you can see Ursula's chart, Zachary.
Yes, yes.
Very good. Okay, so Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the European Union. I've watched a few videos in the last month or so where she seems to be fairly central. But let's just have a look at her chart. The first thing that I noticed is a bit like the charts that we looked at last week of Netanyahu's, and also Putin, very strong Libra. So she has Venus, the Sun, Mercury, Vulcan, and the destiny point, the North Node in Libra. So this is a Libra stellium. So why is it that all these politicians seem to have at the moment a whole lot of Libra? Is it because they are perfect politicians for the times and we are supposed to be able to meet our enemies halfway and find a balanced middle path, as the Buddha told us? The interesting thing about her chart is that a lot of it is caught in this 12th house, which is from that line there to there. So the Libran energy doesn't have easy access to the outer world, and all of her Libran energy has to find its way out through the Scorpio ascendant. She has the 7th degree of Scorpio, and Jupiter and Neptune are actually just at the end of the 12th house, because this is the ascendant here. So people with Scorpio rising can be a little bit all or nothing. They can be passionate warriors for whatever cause they're looking for. Another thing that is interesting about her chart is Uranus. It's a bit like in the one we just looked at a second ago. And I think this Uranus sitting on the midheaven says that she's meant to be an agent of change. She's meant to be on the world stage. She's meant to be diplomatic, looking for the middle ground, making peace. All of those things would fit with Uranus on the midheaven and a Libra stellium. But instead what we see is that she seems to be one of the main people who's beating the drum of war, particularly since Donald Trump sort of said, well, the US are backing out of Ukraine, sort it out yourselves. And you know, there seems to be a very strong push from some, not all of the the European countries to say, well, let's get more military, let's arm up, that Russia's the enemy. And they just seem to be inching closer and closer to global catastrophe. And of course, when you've got a Scorpio rising, well, you know, it has a very warrior energy, very warrior energy. If we're looking at a warrior energy in her chart, you really can't look any further than the Mars-Pluto square.
Mm.
Now, you know, Mars and Pluto are both non-sacred planets from an esoteric level, simply meaning that they are the hardest planets for probably 95% of humanity to deal with, and that's where the shadow hides. That's in her, in me, in most people on the planet. Wherever the Mars and Pluto is where our bad behavior is going to come from. But if you put these two in conflict with each other, that's the square, and almost an exact square. Mars is 2.5 and Pluto's 3. You say, well, there's a battle going on. But if she was battling some of her own demons, maybe this square would be hanging around down here in the lower quadrant. But instead, the battle is going out into the 10th house. Yeah. And the Mars is on the door of the 8th house cusp. So, you know when we enter the path of healing that we have to be very mindful that we don't project our shadow. So if this was a client, I would say to Ursula, there's, you know, you've got a pretty strong self-harm pattern going on, and you're at war with yourself. And have you looked for tools to deal with your shadow or your rage or your sense of injustice? But I guess I wonder whether she's playing some of her own shadow issues out on the world stage, and the Mars-Pluto square's projected to the enemies. And of course, that's one of the things that happens when you have a bit of Scorpio. It's easy to become a little bit paranoid. It's easy to think that nobody can be trusted, that there's enemies everywhere. And of course, if I look further, Mars is the ruler of her past life point. So she's been carrying this internal battle. Now, if she was a person on the path, I'd say you're carrying a pattern of self-hatred and you're sabotaging yourself and you need some therapy. But and I have no way of knowing. I'm hoping that she's done some personal reflecting, some inner what's my baggage. Otherwise, it's all going to get projected out on the enemies. And of course, one other point to make is the planetoid Chiron associated with the willingness to find the bridge between the ego and the soul. It's buried in the chart. It's hidden at the bottom of the chart. And esoterically, we know that whatever planets have been buried on the 4th house cusp, they take a lot of digging up, you know? So it's not easy for her to go inward and look at her own shadow. I might see what Zachary's got to say about it. But
well, that was an excellent analysis. I just pointed out, I'd add that Chiron down at the nadir is in opposition to Uranus and the zenith. Yes. So we're getting a push-pull between Uranus, which in its higher sense is the planet of reform, positive change, new ideas, esoteric studies. Normally speaking, anyone who is an astrologer or interested in astrology has a reasonably strong Uranus. That's the case with both Chandra and myself. But Uranus in the lower sense is the planet of sudden upheaval, rebellion, revolution, rejection of authority, and so on. So she's got this real problematic opposition, in my opinion, between Chiron and Uranus. And that can only really be resolved through fairly intense analysis or self-work. You know, I don't see it being resolved any other way, really. And so that's a real problem in her horoscope. But I don't have much else to add except what Chandra's already said. Or I guess there's one thing that the South Node, well, you've already
Yeah.
touched on the fact that the South Node might well be traumatic for her because it's Aries, and of course, I think you said it last week, Chandra, that what we're seeing now, generally speaking, taking a higher perspective or an overview, what we're seeing is the karma of World War II, really, and especially the shadow aspects of World War II,
Yes.
really working out now in European politics. I think that's very, very accurate, very, very correct.
Another interesting thing about Ursula's chart is you'll notice the mystic rectangle. This is the blue lines that go from Chiron up to the Sun, Mercury, across to Uranus, down to the South Node and the Earth, and back across to Chiron. Now, a mystic rectangle generally means that it's very easy. It's a bit like a magic carpet. You can flow easily in that direction. But because this mystic rectangle involves the past lives, it's very easy for her to recreate patterns from the past. So this is the second European leader we can see who's potentially being driven by internal issues that haven't been resolved from the past. And the Uranus up the top is saying, do it differently. And of course, you see, Uranus in Leo is a generational placement for people in the 50s through to the, I forget, somewhere in the 60s, mid 60s, maybe early 60s. Now, when Uranus in Leo is working from the soul level, it's a heart connection. It's a second ray connection. However, when Uranus is working in Leo from the personality's perspective, then Leo holds a lot of the first ray and the fifth ray. So you can have a very mentally polarized individual, and she's taking her work as a mentally polarized and driving it. I mean, we see the drive of the Scorpio and the Leo in, you know, her rise to power in the EU. And I don't know, I think she might have been there. I did see it somewhere, 3 or 4 years at least, I think. Yeah,
she's been around for 3 or 4 years. I can look at Wikipedia and find her bio.
Yep. But and I guess the other thing I'd say about all the green lines, you see all the sextiles. I've lost my pointer. Here it is. Here's a whole lot of the green lines there, and then down there, and then across and across, and they're creating a cradle. Yeah. So I don't have any doubt that she's got lots of friends, lots of allies, and that she works in a strong, well-constructed network. But is it a network that's taking the safe, old, easy path? I think there was something that I was watching today. Who was it? I forget now. It was basically the speaker. Oh, it was the Greek politician. He was talking about the fact that in the Second World War, Churchill tried to warn everybody about Hitler, and people went down the path of appeasement. And he made the very succinct comment that some of the European leaders are so scared of repeating that old mistake of not taking Hitler seriously that they've latched onto Putin and called him the Hitler, and they're kind of trying to get ahead of the game, but in fact they're driving Europe closer to war rather than following the path of mediation, which is really what all this Libra is all about. I mean, the Polish leader had that energy, and here we have it again. So we've seen the Libran energy in Benjamin Netanyahu's chart. We can see it in Ursula's chart. We can see it in Putin's chart. And, you know, if this was 3 friends who'd fallen out, the astrologer would say, you need to get in the same room and find what it is you have in common rather than what it is that's separating you. Because that's the way, and find a dramatic new way of doing things. And that's the best way to work with the Libran energy, is to meet in the middle and think outside the square. Yeah.
She's been president of the European Union, or the European Commission, since late 2019.
Okay.
Before then, she served in the German federal government between 2005 and 2019, so about 14 years.
Uh-huh.
And she was her most recent position in Angela Merkel's cabinet, because Angela Merkel was German chancellor then, was as federal minister of defense.
Uh-huh.
Quite interesting, eh?
That's the Mars-Pluto square. So
She's a member of the center-right Christian Democratic Union. And let's see. She was born and raised in Brussels, Belgium, to German parents. She graduated from London School of Economics in 78, and she got a medical license from Hanover Medical School. So she's apparently a registered medical professional as well. So that's fairly impressive.
That's the fifth grade. Yeah.
So yeah, she has a fairly outstanding background. It says she served as deputy leader of the CDU, that's the Angela Merkel's party, from 2010 to 2019. She was regarded as a leading contender to succeed Merkel as Chancellor of Germany, and as the favorite to become the Secretary General of NATO after Jens Stoltenberg, who's a Danish guy who just left a few months ago.
Yeah.
So she is fairly.
She's a high flyer.
Credentials, and then you can see in the horoscope, the strong Jupiter. For me, that success, that really outstanding record, that CV is the due to Jupiter. Yeah, Jupiter rising.
Yeah, she does. Zachary says Jupiter on the ascendant, as Zachary says, is that high flying CV, but it's also the fact that she's a Christian. She's got a very strong moral, spiritual driver. Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, I don't have no idea how long we're going for time. Let me just see.
It's about 7:48 now.
It's interesting too, Chandra, that there's at least one grand trine there as well. So there's so much ease in the chart.
Well, that's right. She has some fantastic qualities to do with, she's extremely motivated. That's the fire grand trine. Yeah. So she's been in leadership capacities in past lives. Yeah. She's got this brilliant ability to negotiate and bridge across and network and collaborate. The worrying thing is the Mars-Pluto square. And I just am concerned that she's going to project that and make someone out there the enemy, rather than go, okay, well, because she could be a leader that took Europe to a middle point of peace, because the way I look at it is that all the institutions that were set up after the Second World War have basically, their time's up, and we need a new model and a new way of doing things in Europe. And she could be that person. Yeah. Okay, let's see. I was going to show you the chart of the European Union now, which, can you see that? Talks today. Now, again, we have the same problem. We don't know what time he's born. I've guessed he may be born at 9 o'clock in the evening. But when you don't know what time a person's born, you basically have to ignore the houses and just look at the patterns.
Yeah, that's right.
So let me just see. Now, the reason why, maybe Zachary, can you just introduce his background a little bit before I look at the chart?
Yeah, well, for Australians, it's interesting because he taught at a university in Sydney for 2 or 3 years during the John Howard era. And he ended up leaving Australia because he didn't like the direction Australia was going in, and he didn't like what Howard was becoming. He's a former finance minister of Greece. And every time I've heard him speak, because when he was living in Australia, occasionally he would be invited to go on Q&A. And every time the guy opens his mouth, in my opinion, he's an absolutely brilliant guy, just really, really brilliant. Yep. Interesting. I just had an intuition, Chandra. It's an intuition. I don't know where it came from or how accurate it is. I had an intuition that his rising sign may be late Capricorn, early Aquarius, which would put Saturn and Jupiter on the ascendant.
Okay.
That's just an intuition. That just,
Well, let me see
that
if
from
I
wherever.
let me see if
And
I
that would also put his sun in the second house, more probably in the second house
so
of the
something like
horoscope, which is
that.
money, possession, finance.
Did you say Capricorn rising or Aquarius rising, you thought?
Well, let's say 0 degrees Aquarius.
0. Okay.
0 degrees Aquarius. That's just a guess.
Okay. Can you see me moving the chart?
No, it hasn't moved yet.
Oh, I might have to share it. Just 1 second. Okay, I'll just so that's 3:33 a.m. I think I might need to recast it. 1 second. Just bear with me.
Yeah, we can wait.
I'll rectify it to 3:33 a.m. I think I saw there.
Yeah, see what happens now.
Okay, so that's not quite right, but it's
Oh, that's close enough.
that'll do.
That's close enough.
Yeah.
I
Now,
think that's his horoscope. I
okay,
think that's his real horoscope.
yeah. So Zachary, you get that time. I thought that he had Scorpio, which is why I'd given him Scorpio ascendant. So basically, the Scorpio's gone to the midheaven. I had the intuition when I looked at him. He's an Aries. Now, maybe I'll just let you start and talk about this chart, Zach.
Well, first of all, the fact that he has both Saturn and Jupiter on the ascendant is an amazingly strong position for anyone in any field. The fact that Saturn is in Capricorn, it means it's in its sign of rulership, which is extraordinarily strong and gives an extraordinarily deep grasp of physical plane matters, material issues, physical plane matters. And every time I see him talk in a video, I'm just amazed by the brilliant grasp of details down to sort of a detailed analysis.
Yes.
And then the fact that Jupiter is also on the ascendant in the first house indicates his deep humanitarian concerns. He's a very, very passionate humanitarian guy, in my opinion. So that's a really powerful conjunction of these two important planets.
Yep.
And interesting. I'm gonna take a guess at which planet, at which whether it's 29 Capricorn or 0 degrees Aquarius, as to what might be the exact time. Let me just tune in.
Yeah. While Zachary is tuning in, let's just notice that he has worked in the field of economy, and there's this North Node in Virgo, and he's got a transformational approach. And when I was listening to him talking, he talked about the austerity that had come about as a result of the economy collapsing. Was it about a decade ago, 15 years ago? And he's lived through that austerity, and he doesn't want Germany or France to drive Greece or other countries in Europe into poverty for the sake of a war when they could talk. That's a bit of a synopsis of one of the things that I heard him saying today. Now, his power of oratory is very strong, and if we're right, and Zachary's right, and it is 3:33 a.m., well, then his Aries energy is in the second and the third house. You know, he's somebody who can think on his feet and speak on his feet. And I noticed he was in Australia at the, what do they call it, the press club 2 weeks ago, speaking to Australia. And the message, I watched a 7-minute video of him, and he was basically saying, wake up, Australia, stop following America into every war they have. Think, you know, do things differently. So he's fairly confrontational in his speech, and yet he has this humanitarian approach. And as Zachary said, that's the Jupiter. And then he has this innate compassion, South Node and Mercury. You'd expect someone to have some sort of recent mystical incarnations with that kind of a placement. But continue on, Zach.
Well, Mercury, let's take a closer look at Mercury. Mercury is also opposing Pluto in the horoscope. From house 2 to house number 8. So you've got a Mercury aspecting Pluto, especially in opposition. The individual is going to be reasonably confrontational when he opens his mouth. The interesting thing is both Mercury and Pluto are supported by the Cancer planets. He has his moon at 2 degrees of Cancer and Mars at 10 degrees, and they're forming sextile aspects to Pluto and trines to the Mercury and Pisces position. So that's a really, really powerful position. Also, I noticed that his Mars at 10 degrees of Cancer is exact trine to Neptune, 10 degrees of Scorpio, and Neptune is also trine to Mercury. So the guy's Mercury is getting all sorts of amazing aspects, some confrontational and some really uplifting. So yeah, I can see why he's such an amazing speaker, and the points he makes are really very worthy of deep analysis, deep consideration. That this guy really understands what's going on. You can't fool him.
No,
He's nobody's fool. You can't pull the wool over his eyes, can't bullshit him, can't fool him. This guy will tell you the truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable for some people.
Yeah. And he does have, if this time is correct, then he's got Uranus square the midheaven. So, you know, he's interested in the restoration of democracy rather than democracy being sold out to the highest bidder in the name of war. So it's not an easy chart, and yet he does have that big water grand trine you're talking about. And if that time's right, he's also got a mystic rectangle. So he's got a capacity for extension and engagement as well as this insight. Yeah, very interesting man indeed. Maybe what we'll do with the next bit of time that we've got, does anybody have questions about that? Have you heard about him, Elsa Britt? You're in Europe.
Very strong with the European rearmament will.
Can you hear him?
Yeah. Yep.
Weaken rather than strengthen Europe, and in the process make the world less safe. Under the slogan Peace Through Strength, Europe is rearming, with Germany at the forefront of this rearmament effort. The result will be an even weaker, more totalitarian Europe, deeper economic crisis for European countries, a far right that will continue to gain strength by magnetizing the increasingly impoverished working and lower middle classes, and I'm very much afraid the fragmenting European Union in complete geopolitical disrepute. Looking back, the only strategic goal European Union leaders agreed to consider once Russia invaded Ukraine was a successful NATO-assisted war effort on behalf of Ukraine, by which Russia would be forced behind its pre-2014 borders, while paving the ground for Ukraine to join NATO. That was the plan A, and the only plan that Europe had. However, long before Donald Trump was re-elected, that goal evaporated. Since then, in the absence of a plan B, and in the midst of panic, the European Union has proclaimed rearmament as the panacea. Alas, European rearmament will soon prove a solution worse than the original problem. Before we get to that, it's important to mention the 3 reasons why the European Union's Plan A failed, evaporated. First, the transformation of Russia into a war economy has strengthened rather than weakened Putin's regime. Second, even Trump's predecessor, Joe Biden, despite his false promises to Zelensky, never seriously considered bringing Ukraine into NATO. And thirdly, it was clear that in the United States Congress, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, did not even want to hear of the idea that NATO troops would be fighting alongside the Ukrainians. So, in a display of lamentable hypocrisy, despite the frequent statements that Putin is the new Hitler, the cowardly West continued to send weapons to the exhausted Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians could defeat the new Hitler on their own, on the behalf of Europeans, but on their own, the Ukrainians entirely and utterly on their own. Inevitably, and despite the valiant resistance of the increasingly exhausted Ukrainian soldiers, the European Union's sole strategic objective disappeared, dissolved, evaporated, regardless of who won the United States presidential elections last November. Donald Trump simply told the truth with a bluntness that reflects his long-standing contempt not just for Volodymyr Zelensky, but for the European Union itself. And now? Well, now, a Europe weakened by 2 decades of economic stagnation is struggling to come to terms with the fact that President Trump has abandoned Europe to its illusions and delusions. And thus, rearmament became the go-to knee-jerk reaction of European leaders. Going even further back, you may recall that in 1938, after the Munich agreement, Winston Churchill wrote to the then British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, saying, "You had a choice between war and disgrace. You chose disgrace and you will have war." Well, in their anxiety not to make the same mistake as Chamberlain, EU leaders are ready to repeat it, but in reverse. Their choice to pursue a never-ending war in Ukraine, more and more war until some kind of victory, will inevitably give way to the humiliating peace that Trump will impose upon the Europeans and upon the Zelensky government when the Europeans and Zelensky finally crawl to the White House, or is it Mar-a-Lago, begging. Given all this, undoubtedly, Europe must rise to the occasion. It has to do better than what it is doing. The question is, do what? What exactly is the European Union missing? What is the greatest dearth that it faces? What prevents the European Union from being taken seriously on the geopolitical chessboard? Incredibly, European decision makers will do anything to avoid acknowledging the obvious answer. Europe lacks a proper treasury. Europe lacks the equivalent of the State Department, of a Foreign Office. Europe has no parliament with the power to fire the executive, the European Council. Worse still, there isn't even a debate in Europe on how to fill these huge holes in Europe's flimsy institutional architecture. Military Keynesianism, the bastard child of proper Keynesianism, that of course John Maynard Keynes would immediately deplore, will prove the pretext for shrinking social transfers everywhere in France, Italy, Greece, Spain, across Europe. Which brings me to two questions that I ask of my fellow Europeans. Do we really want a Germany that is arming itself by spending mountains of borrowed money, as well as money grabbed from the already emasculated working people, who are thus turning to the ultra-right, to the neo-fascists? Do you truly think that it is a good thing for Europe and Germany to combine a German military Keynesianism with an increasingly authoritarian state? The German state is becoming increasingly authoritarian. Proof of that, they have no hesitation in sending thousands of police officers to break up gatherings of citizens, including German Jews, who oppose the Palestinian genocide. And does anyone believe that Vladimir Putin will be deterred, will be shaking in his boots at the prospect that Europe may have a few more missiles and rockets? The same Europe that is falling deeper and deeper into political paralysis, and the political dynamic that bolsters the neo-fascists and the AfD in Germany in particular. I think the answers are self-evident. No. Europe's rearmament will give rise to an even weaker Europe, to member states in deeper economic crisis, with the far right gaining strength as they magnetize the increasingly affected working and lower middle classes, pushing the European Union, the whole of the European Union, further into complete geopolitical irrelevance and disrepute. And the alternative, I hear you ask? The alternative is to travel in exactly the opposite direction. Instead of European rearmament, we should work towards putting together Europe's own multidimensional, non-aligned, three-pronged peace process. First, clearly and unequivocally reject Donald Trump's predatory attack on Ukraine's natural resources. Second, with a carrot of sanctions relief and the prospect of returning to Moscow its $300 billion of frozen assets, negotiate with the Kremlin, hopefully with Beijing's participation, a new comprehensive strategic agreement under which Ukraine will become what Austria was during the Cold War: sovereign, neutral, and as integrated with Western Europe and with the rest of Europe as its citizens, the Ukrainian people, desire. Third, instead of a permanent confrontation of heavily armed armies along the Russia-Ukraine border or line of control or ceasefire line, we should propose a demilitarized zone of at least 500 kilometers deep on each side, the right of return of all displaced persons, an agreement on the governance of the disputed territories on the model of the Good Friday Agreement that ended the war in Northern Ireland, and yes, a green investment program for the affected areas to be jointly funded by the European Union and Russia. As for the many outstanding issues, those should be referred to negotiations under the auspices of the United Nations. If we really want to strengthen Europe, the first step is not rearmament at the expense of the social fabric, but a rational peace process that will put a brake on stagnation, on debt, on warmongering, on authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and the new austerity brought about by military Keynesianism. This is Yanis Varoufakis, signing off on the 10th of March.
Absolutely brilliant.
He is. He's completely brilliant.